We are continuing part 2 on slide 5 once again because we need to discuss deadweight loss. So, just to recap, we saw that the consumer surplus had changed as a result of this maximum price, this price control, and the consumers had gained block A but lost triangle B. So, therefore, the change to consumer surplus was plus A minus B. And producer surplus changed from this big triangle to this little triangle. Block A, which formed part of producer surplus before, has now formed part of consumer surplus. This is now your consumer surplus area. So, as a result of your producers getting a lower price P max, those that had a lower marginal cost and were able to stay in the market now only receive this as the producer surplus, and this is transferred to consumer surplus. Producers also lose out on triangle C because output Q1 is what is being supplied, and there are those that would have left the market because they cannot supply at this particular price Pmax because they have a higher marginal cost per unit as represented by this portion of the supply curve. So therefore the loss to producer surplus would have been minus A minus C. So just to recap, you know that your total surplus is always given by your consumer surplus, which was originally this area, and that is added to your producer surplus, which was originally this area. That would give you your total surplus. But now, as a result of this loss of B for consumers, and the loss of minus A and minus C for producers, what is going to be the net effect to total surplus? Now, remember I said that block A is transferred to consumer surplus. So that is not lost in a total sense because it's now forming part of the consumer surplus. However, these two little triangles, triangle B and triangle C, is lost in terms of both your consumer and producer surplus, but it's a loss to total surplus. So these two triangles B and C is what is referred to as a deadweight loss. And a deadweight loss is defined as a net loss of total surplus. So this was a net loss to total surplus. This portion was lost by consumers and this portion was lost by producers. Now, you are going to be expected to calculate these areas. So you may be required to determine what the old consumer surplus was and the new consumer surplus, and hence determine the change. The same would apply to producer surplus to determine the change in producer surplus, and then what is the net effect on total surplus and what would be the deadweight loss. So you would be given values in terms of your coordinates, your intercepts, your equilibrium price and quantity. Well, as such, you won't be given it, you would be required to calculate it, and then you can determine those particular areas. And it's straightforward if you think about it because you're having to determine rectangles and triangles. So that represents your deadweight loss. Now we're going to move on to figure 9.3. So here we're going to see the same story as what we saw in the previous figure. Government again institutes a maximum price or a price ceiling given by P max over here, right? There's your price ceiling. But what do you notice is different about this figure? What do you notice about this demand curve? Can you see that it is steeper than the previous one? So here the demand curve is inelastic in this example. Now, if you're going to compare these shapes, remember this was a gain to consumer surplus and this was a loss to consumer surplus. But in the previous example, rectangle A was bigger than triangle B, which is why the net effect to consumers was still a gain because block A was greater than block B. However, you could have a scenario, as you see here, where you have an inelastic demand curve, and as a result of it, the triangle B, which is part of the deadweight loss to consumers, is greater than rectangle A. So, as a result of it, this is a net loss to consumers. Slides 7 and 8 have an example demonstrating how this analysis can be applied. So, in this example, it deals with price controls and natural gas shortages. You can see that you are given values, so you could very easily determine your changes in your consumer and your producer surplus. So, please work through this example in your own time as a case study and the type of application you could expect. This is just the continuation. We will continue on slide 9. Section 9.2 deals with the efficiency of a competitive market. So it is important for us to evaluate the efficiency of a competitive market. So what do you understand by efficiency or economic efficiency? Economic efficiency is here defined as the maximization of aggregate or your total consumer surplus and producer surplus. So if you want to maximize it, of course, you want to get the most out of what you could get for your consumer and producer surplus. So you saw in the previous figure that with the price controls instituted by the government, you saw how that could result in a deadweight loss, and that is an efficiency cost. But the question you need to ask yourself, and that you would have learnt in your introductory macro and other courses as well, is are competitive markets always efficient? Now, yes, for the most part they are, but market failures do arise. There are instances of market failures. So, market failures can be defined as a situation in which an unregulated competitive market is inefficient because the prices fail to provide proper signals to consumers and producers. Remember, your market, that price mechanism, it provides signals to your consumers and producers. And there are two instances of market failures that are important for you to note. Those are externalities and a lack of information. Now, in terms of externalities, an externality is an action taken by either a producer or a consumer which affects other producers or consumers, but it's not accounted for by the market price. Now, if you do public economics, which is it was a second year course, but now it is a third year course. Public economics, you will learn about positive and negative externalities. Now, a positive externality, an example of that is education, where the benefit to you paying for, let's say, your education, it does not accrue to that individual as a whole, but there could be a social benefit to the household, for instance. And is that accounted for by the market price? But now, the ones that we are concerned with here more so are negative externalities. And a negative externality, or bad as such, an example is pollution. So you could have a producer and there could be a negative externality in that production process where there's effluent or waste, and that represents a social cost. And is that social cost accounted for in the market price? Okay, so that is an example of a market failure. Another example is that of a lack, or the consumers lack information or full, complete information about the quality or nature of a product. So in so doing, we cannot make utility maximizing purchasing decisions. And government intervention is very often required. And here an example is truth in labeling. So I can think of examples where in the past the study was done. It may have been, I think, by Stellenbosch researchers, where they examined meat products. And let's say on the packaging it reflected beef, but that product wasn't 100% pure beef, for instance, and it was made up of other aspects. X amount was water, X amount could have been water buffalo, etc. So that full information wasn't communicated to the consumer in terms of the packaging. So that is just one example. Another is health packaging. Health packaging is sometimes misleading. It may say low fat or healthy, but what does that mean? Something could be low fat, but then I've added sugars to improve the flavor. So truth in labeling is an example where we're trying to account for the lack of information that consumers may have to make utility maximizing decisions. Now, figure 9.5 is going to illustrate an example of a price control where government sets the price above the market clearing price. So this is an example of a price floor or minimum price. So here you can see the price, the market clearing price would have been P0, and the output at that price would have been Q0. However, if government sets a price control, P2, that is above the market clearing price, so a price floor, what is going to be the resultant outcome in terms of consumer and producer surplus? So in this case now, with this higher price, this price P2 above the market clearing price, you are going to find that producers would want to increase their quantity supplied from what was the original quantity supplied or the output at equilibrium. Now with this higher price, they would want to increase that to Q2. However, the consumer would, as a result of this higher price, only demand Q3. So quantity has fallen from Q0 to Q3 in terms of the consumer's quantity demanded at this price P2. So if producers do produce Q3, that will be the output. The deadweight loss is now going to be given by triangle B and C. Consumers lose rectangle A to producers. So rectangle A was part of the consumer surplus, but now it will form part of the producer surplus because of this higher price. And consumers also lose triangle B because only this output is being demanded. Remember, at this higher price, these consumers are not willing to pay this higher price. So they don't purchase and they would then lose out on triangle B. And if we think of it now from the producer side, producers would gain rectangle A, that is a transfer from consumer surplus to producer surplus. But on the other hand, they are going to lose triangle C because if they realize that only Q3 is going to be demanded, that would be the output. So as a result, these producers would end up exiting and that production won't take place. So hence C is also lost. However, if some producers were to produce more than Q3, then we would find that the deadweight loss would be greater than what is given by triangle B and triangle C together, because the deadweight loss to producers would be even greater. And we're going to see that in the next section. So just to see, there is an example on slide 11 and 12. So please go through this practical example just to enhance your understanding again and to see how this analysis can be applied. We'll continue the next part on slide 13.